Hi Reddit. Honestly, I never thought I'd share this, but life forced me to. My childhood and growing up weren't like everyone else's. I always considered myself a normal son. I loved my parents, tried to be good. But what does good even mean? And how do you realize that even a good person can be erased? When I was little, I dreamed of a family like in the movies. A cozy home, laughter, holidays where everyone supports each other. We seemed to have that kind of home. Dad was strict but sometimes gentle, Mom was caring but with a sly streak. I remember those evenings. I'd quietly do my homework in the corner, listening as Mark, my older brother, talked about his great grades, or Lena, my sister, got praise for her dancing or drawings. And me, I was just there, like background. I tried to stand out, helped my parents, studied well, participated in school contests. But all my achievements, praises, and efforts seemed non-existent. My brother was the ideal one, and my parents constantly emphasized that. Lena was Mom's favorite, beautiful, sociable, always in the spotlight. And me, I was just the backup option. I remember one phrase from Mom when I was 12. "You know, son, you're so modest. I hope one day you'll become someone important." I smiled and nodded, but inside I felt emptiness. It wasn't support. It was a foreshadowing that I'd never truly be noticed. Years passed. I finished college, got a job, built a career. I seemed like an adult, independent person. But the pain and feeling of being extra never went away. Any calls to my parents, attempts to share about my life, invitations to dinner, always met with almost no response. They praised Mark and Lena, ignoring me. I thought, fine, I don't need their praise, I'll manage on my own. And I did. But everything changed one day when I got a letter from a lawyer. It was formal, dry, emotionless. "Dear Mr. Author's name, in accordance with the latest revision of your parents' will, you are not an heir to their property." I reread the line several times. At first I didn't believe it. Then came a wave of anger, followed by emptiness. My heart pounded in my chest as if someone had pulled out all the supports. How is this possible? The people who gave me life completely excluded me. That evening, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by books, childhood photos, old furniture, and for the first time in a long while, I cried. The feeling of betrayal and loss mixed with an unusual relief. Now no one could manipulate me through money or inheritance. The following weeks were torturous. I tried to understand why this happened. I talked to my brother and sister, they were shocked. But my parents gave no explanations. Every call went unanswered, every visit ended in cold silence. About 2 years passed, and suddenly the phone rang. On the other end was Mom. Her voice trembled. We need your help. Seriously, Nate." I froze. This was the same woman who cut me out of the will. The one who ignored my achievements, who made me invisible. Now she was begging. I hung up to collect my thoughts. A mix of anger, distrust, and internal conflict overwhelmed me. But something inside told me I should find out the details. A few days later, I met them in a neutral place. They looked completely different, not the usual cold gaze, but frightened, embarrassed people. Mom and Dad explained that they'd been hiding this for years. Debts, risk of losing the business, medical expenses. Their financial situation was catastrophic. They'd built an image of a wealthy, confident family, but in reality, everything was falling apart. And now they needed someone who could save them. I listened and thought, there it is. Their real motivation, money. They don't need my care. They need my skills and experience. And then I realized, I have power. Power over the people who once hurt me. I could choose one of two paths: forgive and help, or get revenge. I decided to help first, not out of pity but to set everything on my terms. I offered debt restructuring, legal support, financial control. My parents were embarrassed but agreed. The work went on for months. I dove into their accounts, documents, credit obligations. I often woke up at night thinking about how easily their lives could collapse. I saw fear, shame, and at the same time, attempts to hide weaknesses. My parents were showing vulnerability for the first time, and it was a strange, almost surreal experience. With each meeting and conversation, I felt strength and control. My life and career, which they ignored, now became the key to their survival. They started appreciating what they once despised. After a few months, we made progress. Debts were restructured, medical bills paid, part of the business saved. But most importantly, I saw them change. Fear and pride gave way to cautious respect. I kept my distance. None of them could make me feel extra anymore. Now the power was in my hands. And then something happened that I didn't expect. Mom said, "We were wrong. I was wrong all this time." Simple words, but they meant so much more to me. Acknowledgement of mistakes. Acknowledgement that I deserved the respect and love they'd hidden from me for so long. I looked at them and thought about my past, about how years of pain and ignoring made me stronger, about how I managed on my own. And in that moment, I understood one thing. Power isn't in revenge. Power is in choice, in control over your life, and the ability to set boundaries. My story isn't over yet. The next steps will be tough. I had to decide whether to include myself in the will, how to handle my brother and sister, how to maintain respect and distance. But one thing I knew for sure, I'll never be extra again. After I helped my parents stabilize their financial situation, it seemed like the tension should ease. But something inside me said this was just the beginning. For the first time, I felt I could control the situation, but with that came the realization. I couldn't trust them completely. They'd always been good at manipulating, even without words. At first, I watched them cautiously. Every glance, every phrase, every hand movement. Now it was like an open book to me. I saw fear in their eyes, attempts to hide weakness, but also regret and genuine remorse. They were dependent on me, and that feeling of power was unfamiliar, almost intoxicating. Mom called one evening. "We want to thank you for everything. Without you, we would have." She hesitated. "I understand," I replied calmly. "But thanks aren't enough. Words won't fix anything. Actions matter more." My tone was cold. I didn't want them to think I'd forgive easily. I felt I needed to set the rules of the game, and they had to accept them. The following weeks, I spent sorting through legal documents. I learned that their will wasn't just a formality, it was a tool of control. They'd completely cut me out, and my brother and sister got everything: the apartment, business, investments. I understood. If I wanted revenge, it would be easy. I had the information, knowledge, and influence to ruin their plans. But revenge wasn't in my plans. I wanted something bigger: respect. So they understood the price I paid to be independent, and so they could never ignore me again. I started small, changed the debt restructuring terms. I insisted that all decisions go through me. Any major financial operation required my approval. My parents, who used to ignore my advice, were now forced to listen. One evening, while we discussed the business together, Dad, who was usually cold and confident, looked at me and said, "You're really stronger than we thought." I noticed a slight tremor in his voice. It was an acknowledgement, though restrained. I nodded without smiling. But power isn't just control over finances. It's control over emotions, over the past. I started recalling every moment they hurt me, every word, every look, every underestimation. And I realized I could use this to create a new dynamic. I could set boundaries that once seemed impossible. The next step was risky. I suggested they include me in the will again, but on my terms. "I can help you," I said, "but if you want me to really be involved in the future, something has to change." They were silent. A long pause. I saw fear in their eyes. This was a game they'd never played before. "Okay," Mom finally said, "we agree." With that agreement came not relief, but new responsibility. I understood that now I stood at a crossroads. On one side, family; on the other, my principles and personal independence. Weeks passed, and I watched their behavior. Sometimes old habits surfaced. Attempts to manipulate, evade conversations, hide details. And I understood, trust must be earned and they had to prove they'd changed. During this time, I confronted my brother and sister. They were surprised by my return to the family game. Mark, the older brother, looked irritated. "What have you achieved?" he asked with a note of disdain. "Control over what really matters," I replied evenly. "And by the way, it's none of your business." Lena was more diplomatic. "We just want to keep the peace." "Peace is when everyone understands their boundaries," I said. These conversations weren't just family quarrels. They were tests. Tests of who really has influence now and whose decisions will matter. Gradually, I started seeing my parents change. They learned to work with me, listen, acknowledge my achievements. It was strange, almost surreal, to see people who once ignored your existence now seeking advice, agreeing with your decisions, even thanking you for fixing their mistakes. But with that came a new feeling, the sense of power not as revenge, but as control over my own life. I was no longer the extra family member. I was a key player. And one night, sitting in my apartment looking at childhood photos, I realized the story would change again. The parents who once cut me out of their lives were now dependent on me. That dependence gave me power, but it also required wisdom. I understood that two harsh steps could destroy everything. At this stage, I realized the main lesson. Power isn't revenge, not money, not acknowledgement. Power is the ability to choose how to act, set boundaries, and influence the situation while maintaining self-respect. I saw how my parents were changing, how they were learning to value me. But ahead were even more trials. My brother and sister, my parents' hidden motives, new financial crises, and unexpected twists that threatened to destroy everything I'd built. And it was at that moment I understood. The real story is just beginning. Despite establishing control over my parents' financial affairs, the real challenge was just starting. My brother and sister, Mark and Lena, weren't going to just accept my influence. I knew they felt threatened, and that feeling was mutual. I understood that any action of theirs could be an attempt to regain control or test my tolerance. Mark showed up first. He invited me to an honest meeting, though the tone of his letter was a barely concealed threat. I sensed he was ready for open conflict but also waiting for a chance to manipulate. We met in a quiet cafe where no one could see us, and he got straight to the point. "You think everything's under control now?" he asked, holding back anger. "What if I tell our parents I don't agree with your decisions?" I looked at him calmly and said, "You can say whatever you want, but if the decision involves finances or business, it won't have force without my involvement. That's it." His eyes widened. He tried to smile, but it was tense. I understood that his pride and ambitions were hurt. Mark had always seen himself as the main heir, and now I was questioning that. "You have no right," he started, but I interrupted. "I do have the right, not because I'm malicious or want revenge, but because both of you neglected me all my life. Now I have the chance to fix the situation, not for myself, but for all of us." Lena, my sister, turned out to be more cunning. She decided to act through emotions. Her first step was trying to evoke guilt in our parents against me, accusing me of excessive harshness and interfering in family matters. But I anticipated this move. I carefully observed, taking notes, gathering evidence of who was trying to manipulate the situation and how. Internally, I realized, to maintain power, I didn't just need to oppose them, I needed to outmaneuver them. I started implementing a transparency system. Any financial transaction, any major purchase or real estate decision now went through me. My parents hesitated at first, but over time, they saw that it really helped stabilize their position. However, personal emotions were becoming more complicated. Deep down, I understood that this whole game wasn't just about money. It was about acknowledgement, respect, and self-identification. Every time my parents thanked me, I felt a mix of satisfaction and pain. After all, These were the same people who ignored me for years. One evening, I got an unexpected call from my parents' lawyer. He reported that new financial documents had appeared, debts, hidden assets, and contracts that could change the whole picture. I felt a slight chill in my chest. These documents could destroy everything we'd built. I immediately summoned my parents to me. Their faces were pale, eyes wide open. They knew I'd found out. We tried to handle it ourselves. Mom started, but I interrupted. You didn't try, you hid it. Now the situation is critical. We have to act together. It was at that moment I first felt I could be the real family leader. Not through authoritarianism, but through strategic management and control of information. My parents looked at me with respect and anxiety at the same time. The following weeks were tense. I worked on restructuring debts, fixing mistakes they'd made in trying to hide the truth, and supported them morally in parallel. But my brother and sister didn't back off. They tried to use any weaknesses, secret meetings with parents, complaints about me, pressure through relatives. I knew the usual reaction would be anger or resentment, but I acted differently. I gathered all evidence of their manipulation attempts but didn't use it directly. Instead, I strengthened transparency. Any actions were discussed openly, any financial transaction was recorded. This way, I not only protected myself but also taught my parents how to deal with manipulations. And then came the turning point. One day, Mark tried to secretly withdraw part of the money from our parents' bank account for his personal project. I noticed it through a notification that automatically went to my phone. When I called Mark, he first denied it, then made excuses. "It's just an investment," he said. "I thought you wouldn't mind." "You thought wrong," I replied calmly. "Any operation without the consent of all participants will be canceled, and this rule applies to everyone." Mark fell silent. I felt this was the first major victory. Not revenge, not humiliation, but simply establishing the rules of the game where everyone knows their boundaries. But the emotional part of the story was getting more complicated. My parents started opening up. They talked about how hard it was for them to realize their mistakes, how they regretted ignoring me and my achievements. I listened, and though part of me wanted to break down in tears, I kept a cold gaze. It was necessary to not lose control. One night, sitting alone in my apartment, I started writing a list of all the situations where my parents tried to manipulate me. I realized, to maintain my influence, I had to be a strategist, not an emotional participant. This gave me a sense of inner discipline and strength. But the real test was ahead. Lena, learning about my methods, decided to act differently. She tried to bribe one of their business partners to hide our parents' financial weakness. I found out about it through an indirect contact, a coincidence that later became key. I summoned my parents, explained the whole situation, and together we decided. The whole family must act as one, or the consequences would be catastrophic. This was the moment of truth. They realized my role wasn't just in financial recovery, but in uniting the family. After that, the tension eased a bit. Mark and Lena gradually started acknowledging my decisions. My parents began showing genuine gratitude and respect, and for the first time I felt I could trust them, though cautiously. It was during this period that I understood the main lesson. Power isn't revenge, not money, not control. Power is the ability to influence the situation, protect yourself and your family, set boundaries, and maintain respect for others. But despite the temporary calm, I knew more serious trials awaited ahead. New financial crises, unexpected interference from my brother and sister, old debts, legal disputes. All of this could destroy the fragile balance I'd created over months. And it was then that I first understood. The real story is just beginning. After I established control over my parents' financial affairs and started protecting them from Mark and Lena's manipulations, life suddenly stopped being predictable. It seemed like I'd taken the situation under control, but the real trials were just beginning. The first alarming signal was a call from the bank. Their voice was official, almost emotionless. "We've detected an attempt to withdraw a large sum from one of your accounts." I instantly realized it was Lena. She was trying to act covertly, hoping no one would find out. I felt a mix of anger and determination. This was a test of my discipline. I recorded the conversation, prepared evidence, and notified my parents. For the first time, they saw that I could protect their interests not just with my mind, but with an iron grip. My authority grew, but so did the tension in the family. Mark, learning about Lena's interference, started acting differently. He stopped hiding his attempts at influence and began openly arguing about the decisions I made. He insisted on risky investments that could ruin the business. "You don't understand," he said. "I know how to increase profits. You're too cautious." "I understand much more than you think," I replied calmly. "But I also know that risk must be manageable or we'll lose everything." He'd fall silent, but inside I felt the next conflict was inevitable. It was at this moment that the emotional battle began. My parents, who previously saw me only as a helper, started opening up. Mom confessed that years of ignoring my efforts weren't just her fault, but a result of societal pressure, her own fears and insecurity. "We were afraid you wouldn't cope," she said one evening. "We thought Mark and Lena were better prepared." I listened and understood this was an attempt to justify themselves. But at the same time, I felt it was a sincere confession. For the first time in years, she was voicing my strengths out loud, not just comparing me to my brother and sister. With each day, the pressure on me intensified. Lena tried to influence our parents through emotions, Mark through rational arguments and threats, and I was in the middle, between the desire to protect the family and the need to maintain control. One night Mom called me, her voice trembling. "We got a letter from the lawyer. They want to declare part of the debts invalid, but it needs your decision." I realized this was the moment of truth. If I agreed to their terms, it could save some assets but open the door to new manipulations. If I refused, I risked completely destroying trust. I decided to act strategically. I invited my parents to a cafe where we could discuss calmly. I laid out all the options, showed the consequences of each decision, explained the risks and benefits. They listened, sometimes interrupting, sometimes agreeing, but it was clear that for the first time they felt the decision truly belonged to me. "We trust you," Mom said finally, "but it's scary." "Fear is normal," I replied, "but we must act rationally, and I guarantee I'll save everything I can." The following days were tough. I made decisions that changed the family's life. Some relatives didn't like it, and I felt pressure from all sides. But gradually, I understood that real power isn't control over people, but the ability to manage the consequences of their actions. Mark didn't give up. He tried to intimidate me with threats, hinting that he could challenge my decisions in court. I listened and understood that emotions wouldn't help. I needed to act systematically. I gathered all the documentation, all letters, all records of conversations and consultations with lawyers. Now, if he decided to go to court, I'd be ready. Lena acted more sophisticatedly. She tried to involve our parents' old connections to create an illusion of support from the outside world. But I anticipated this. Every attempt of hers was documented, and our parents themselves started seeing her true motives. It was during this period that I first felt I could be a real leader, not through authoritarianism, not through fear, but through strategic management, transparency, and honesty. My parents started turning to me not just for help, but for advice. For the first time, they saw me as someone capable of protecting them and the family. But the emotional part of the story was even more complicated. I started feeling that part of me still wanted revenge for years of neglect, for ignoring my successes. That feeling was strong, but I learned to control it. I understood that revenge destroys not only others but yourself. The real trial came unexpectedly. One evening, I got a call from the lawyer. Our parents' business was under threat of immediate bankruptcy. The cause wasn't just hidden debt, but errors that Mark and Lena tried to hide or fix on their own. "We need your help urgently," the lawyer said. "Otherwise, everything will be lost." I realized this was the decisive moment. If I made a mistake, the consequences would be catastrophic. If I acted right, I could not only save the business but also finally establish balance within the family. I summoned my parents, Mark and Lena. We gathered at our parents' house, where for the first time in a long while everyone was together. I spread out the documents on the table, explained the strategy, and proposed a plan of action. At that moment, something amazing happened. My parents listened to me for the first time without interrupting, without distrust, without fear. We started acting. I coordinated every step, fixed errors, controlled financial flows, consulted with lawyers. Mark and Lena, seeing the effectiveness of my actions, gradually began to cooperate, though their pride suffered. Over several weeks, we stabilized the situation. The business was saved, debts partially restructured, financial transparency established. But most importantly, the relationships within the family changed. My parents started seeing me as someone capable of making decisions and leading the family. And that's when I understood the main lesson. Real power isn't revenge, not money, not control. It's the ability to make tough decisions, protect those you love, and maintain honesty and respect. Conflicts with my brother and sister didn't disappear completely, but they became manageable. I learned to anticipate their actions, maintain calm, and use information strategically. My parents, for the first time, felt they could trust me not just as a son, but as a leader. And it was at that moment I first realized life isn't about who's right, but about how you use your strengths to protect and build, not destroy. But even then, I knew the story wasn't over. New trials awaited ahead, new dilemmas, new challenges. And only time would show how strong our family had become and how ready I was for the next steps.